It starts with something so ordinary, so familiar that most people never think twice about it. A cold glass of milk on the breakfast table, a slice of cheese on a sandwich, a scoop of ice cream on a hot summer day. Dairy has woven itself into cultures and cuisines across the world, marketed as the ultimate symbol of health, vitality, and comfort. From the time we are children, we are told that milk makes us strong, that dairy is essential, and that the cows who give it to us live peaceful, happy lives in green pastures. But behind the gentle images of rolling fields and smiling cows is a reality few consumers ever see and even fewer want to confront. The dairy industry, from the megafarms of the United States to the sprawling milk cooperatives in Europe and the rapidly expanding markets in Asia, operates in a way that hides some of its most brutal truths from the public. And those truths touch on everything: animal welfare, environmental destruction, worker exploitation, and a system built not on kindness, but on calculated efficiency and profit. To understand the dark truth about the dairy industry, we must first strip away the marketing and look at the raw mechanics of production. Milk doesn't simply flow endlessly from a cow because she's happy and healthy. Like all mammals, cows produce milk only after giving birth. This means that for dairy farms to maintain constant production, cows must be kept on a continuous cycle of pregnancy, birth, and milking. It is not a natural rhythm, it is an industrial process calibrated down to the last detail. A dairy cow's life typically begins in a calving pen, but the moment she enters the system, her fate is predetermined. If she's female, she will be raised to join the milking herd. If she's male, his life takes a very different turn. Male calves have no use in milk production, and in most cases, they are either sold for veal slaughtered within weeks or disposed of in other ways. This culling of male calves is one of the industry's most closely guarded practices, seldom shown in advertisements and rarely discussed by those who profit from dairy. For the females, life quickly becomes a repetitive cycle. Artificial insemination is the industry standard for breeding, not because it is better for the cows, but because it allows farms to control genetics, timing, and output with precision. Within hours or days of giving birth, the calf is separated from its mother. This separation is traumatic for both. Cows have been observed bellowing and searching for their young for days afterward, while calves cry for their mothers. The rationale given by the industry is that separation reduces disease risk and ensures milk intended for humans isn't consumed by the calf. But the emotional toll is rarely acknowledged. Once separated, the cow is put on a rigorous milking schedule 2 to 3 times a day, often in mechanized milking parlors. While some small farms still milk by hand, large-scale operations rely on machines that extract milk quickly, sometimes causing injuries like teat abrasions, infections, and mastitis, a painful inflammation of the udder that is alarmingly common in industrial dairy farming. Mastitis not only causes suffering for the cow, but also leads to pus entering the milk supply, which is then managed through pasteurization. To keep production high, cows are often bred for unnaturally large udders and higher yields, pushing their bodies beyond natural limits. In the 1950s, an average dairy cow in the United States produced about 5,000 pounds of milk per year. Today, through selective breeding, high-energy feed, and relentless milking schedules, that figure has more than quadrupled, with many cows producing over 22,000 pounds annually. This extraordinary output comes at a cost. The animals' bodies wear out quickly. A cow that could live 20 years naturally is often slaughtered for cheap beef by the age of 5 or 6, when her milk yield begins to decline. The image of happy cows on sunny farms is further undermined by the reality of how most dairy cattle are housed. In many industrial farms, cows spend the majority of their lives indoors, standing on concrete floors with little or no access to pasture. Overcrowding is common, and the lack of space leads to injuries, hoof problems, and stress. While some countries have higher welfare regulations than others, the underlying structure of industrial dairy farming prioritizes productivity over well-being. And then there's the environmental cost. The dairy industry is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane, which is produced by cows during digestion. In addition, the massive amounts of manure generated by dairy farms can pollute waterways, damage ecosystems, and harm local communities. Water usage is another concern. Producing just 1 gallon of milk can require hundreds of gallons of water when you factor in feed production, cow hydration, and cleaning. In recent years, the industry has faced growing scrutiny from environmentalists, animal welfare advocates, and even nutritionists who question the health claims long used to promote dairy. Yet powerful lobbying groups continue to influence policy, secure subsidies, and shape public perception, ensuring that milk remains a dietary staple and a multi-billion-dollar global business. In this investigation, we will go deeper into the barns, the boardrooms, and the communities living in the shadow of industrial dairy. We will hear from whistleblowers, scientists, and those who have worked inside the system. We will examine the global supply chain from the small farms struggling to survive to the multinational conglomerates dominating the market. The glass of milk on your table is not just a product. It is the end result of a complex and often hidden story, one that raises urgent questions about ethics, sustainability, and our relationship with the animals whose lives are shaped by our appetites. The gates open and the smell hits you first, a dense, acrid mixture of manure, ammonia, and silage that clings to your skin, hair, and clothes. It's a smell that never quite leaves you even after you shower. This is the scent of industrial dairy farming, not the sweet hay and fresh grass that marketing suggests, but the compressed reality of thousands of animals kept in tight, mechanized spaces, engineered for maximum output. Here, in the milking barns of large-scale operations, the cow is not an animal in the traditional sense. She is a unit of production, a biological machine, whose value is measured in gallons of milk per day, and the speed at which she can be processed through the system. The day begins early, often before dawn. Workers, many of them migrants paid low wages, move through the barns to bring the first batch of cows into the milking parlor. These parlors are designed like assembly lines. Rows of cows stand in narrow stalls, their heads locked in place, while suction cups are attached to their teats. The machines whir and pulse rhythmically, extracting milk with relentless precision. From the outside, this can look efficient, even clinical. But standing beside the machines, you see the toll it takes on the animals. The constant milking leaves the skin raw and chapped. In some cows, the suction cups attach to already inflamed udders, causing visible flinches of pain. Mastitis, an infection caused by bacteria entering through the teat canal, spreads easily in these conditions, and when untreated, it can cause swelling pus and fever. The milk from infected cows doesn't go to waste. It is mixed in with the general supply after pasteurization. For the cows, this process is repeated 2 or 3 times a day every day with little variation. Between milkings, they spend their hours in concrete floored pens or confined stalls known as tie stalls, where movement is limited to a few steps forward or back. Some facilities offer free stall housing where cows can roam between feeding areas and rest spaces. But even here, the floors are hard, the air is heavy with ammonia, and space is restricted by the sheer number of animals. Contrary to the pasture-raised imagery in advertisements, many industrial dairy cows never graze on open fields. They eat a carefully calculated diet of corn, silage, hay, and supplements designed to maximize milk production. Fresh grass, if it appears in their diet at all, is an occasional luxury. The logic is simple. Pasture requires more space, more labor, and less control over feed composition. And in an industry where margins are thin and competition is fierce, every variable must be controlled. But the most jarring moment in a dairy cow's life isn't the milking, it's the separation from her calf. This is where the system reveals one of its most deeply hidden cruelties. Within hours or days of birth, the calf is taken away. Workers carry the newborn to a separate pen, often while the mother bellows in distress, pacing the stall and calling out for her young. Cows form strong maternal bonds, and the abrupt severing of that connection is a source of emotional stress, something even seasoned dairy workers quietly acknowledge but rarely discuss publicly. The calves themselves are sorted by sex. Female calves are fed milk replacer, a formula designed to mimic their mother's milk, and raised to eventually join the milking herd. Male calves, having no value in dairy production, are destined for veal or cheap beef. In some places, they are confined to small pens, veal crates, where they cannot turn around, an intentional restriction, meant to keep their muscles tender. Animal welfare laws have banned or limited this practice in certain regions, but enforcement is inconsistent, and the veal industry still thrives in markets where regulations are lax. The daily routine for dairy workers is grueling. Long hours, repetitive tasks, and low pay are the norm. Injuries from heavy machinery, chemical cleaners, or unpredictable animal behavior are common. Many workers are undocumented migrants who have little recourse if they are injured or exploited. For them, speaking out carries risks far beyond losing a job. It could mean deportation. While the physical realities of industrial dairy farming are harsh, there's another layer of the story that's harder to see, but equally important: the mental toll on the animals. Studies have shown that cows are intelligent social creatures capable of forming friendships and experiencing complex emotions. In high-intensity dairy environments, these instincts are suppressed by confinement noise and constant human intervention. Cows kept in stressful environments have elevated cortisol levels, a biological sign of chronic stress, and yet none of this is visible to the average consumer. The milk in the supermarket carries no label detailing the lives of the cows who produced it. The system depends on this invisibility. Just as slaughterhouses are hidden from public view, so too are the milking barns and calf pens of industrial dairy farms. The reality is sanitized before it reaches the shelves, replaced with images of green pastures and healthy, happy cows. In this hidden world, every cow has a number, not a name. Her life is measured in lactation cycles, not years lived. When her production begins to drop, usually around age 5 or 6, she is sent to slaughter. Her meat, often tough from years of hard use, is turned into cheap ground beef or processed products. The system replaces her immediately, ensuring that the milk flow never stops. When you pour a glass of milk, you might see a simple beverage, white, pure, and wholesome. But beyond that glass lies an environmental footprint, so vast and complex that it spans continents, pollutes oceans, and contributes significantly to the climate crisis. The dairy industry's environmental cost is one of its best-kept secrets, overshadowed by discussions of animal welfare and health. Yet for the planet, these costs are devastating. To begin with, there is the sheer scale of the industry. Worldwide, over 270 million dairy cows produce nearly 900 million tons of milk each year. To sustain this output, vast amounts of land are cleared for feed crops, primarily corn, soy, and alfalfa. These crops require enormous volumes of water and heavy use of fertilizers and pesticides, which seep into rivers and groundwater. In regions like California's Central Valley, one of the largest dairy-producing areas in the world, this agricultural runoff has created nitrate contamination so severe that some communities can't drink their tap water without risking illness. Then there's the waste. A single dairy cow produces roughly 120 pounds of manure per day. On a farm with thousands of cows, that's hundreds of tons of waste every week. Unlike human sewage, which is treated animal manure from large farms, is often stored in open-air lagoons or spread onto fields as fertilizer. While this might sound environmentally friendly, the reality is different. Lagoons can overflow during storms, sending raw waste into rivers and lakes, killing fish and poisoning aquatic ecosystems. Spreading manure on fields can lead to runoff during rain, contaminating waterways with pathogens like E. coli and contributing to harmful algal blooms that suffocate marine life. But perhaps the most pressing environmental concern is greenhouse gas emissions. Dairy cows are ruminants, meaning they digest food through fermentation in a specialized stomach. This process produces methane, a greenhouse gas over 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. Globally, the livestock sector accounts for about 14.5% of all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, and dairy production alone contributes nearly 3% of that total. That's more than the entire aviation industry. Methane isn't the only issue. The production and transport of feed crops release large amounts of carbon dioxide, while manure stored in lagoons emits nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas nearly 300 times more potent than CO2. Combined, these gases make dairy a major driver of climate change. And unlike emissions from fossil fuels, which can be reduced with renewable energy, methane from cows is an inherent part of industrial dairy farming. Deforestation adds another layer to the problem. In South America, particularly in Brazil and Argentina, forests are cleared to grow soy that feeds dairy and beef cattle around the world. The destruction of these ecosystems not only releases stored carbon, but also eradicates habitats for countless species, pushing biodiversity to the brink. Water consumption is another staggering figure. Producing just 1 gallon of milk requires approximately 880 gallons of water, when factoring in the water needed to grow feed, crops, hydrate cows, and clean equipment. In water-stressed regions, this creates direct competition between agricultural needs and local communities' access to clean water. In some cases, industrial dairies have been accused of depleting aquifers, leaving nearby residents with dry wells. The environmental damage doesn't stop at the farm. Milk must be transported, processed, packaged, and distributed, all of which require energy. Most dairy processing plants run on fossil fuels, and the packaging, often made of plastic-lined cartons or single-use plastics, adds to the global waste problem. Even when cartons are recyclable, many end up in landfills due to inadequate recycling infrastructure. Environmental activists have long warned about the dairy industry's impact, but change is slow. Part of the reason is the industry's immense political power. Dairy cooperatives and corporate lobbyists work aggressively to maintain subsidies, shape environmental regulations, and promote milk as a health necessity. In the United States alone, billions of dollars in subsidies flow into the dairy sector each year, keeping prices low and production high, regardless of the environmental toll. Internationally, the situation varies, but follows the same trend. As developing countries' economies grow, so does demand for dairy. China, once a relatively low dairy consumer, has become one of the fastest-growing markets, prompting rapid industrial expansion. This growth is marketed as a sign of prosperity, but it comes with a predictable increase in environmental degradation. The dairy industry often counters criticism by pointing to technological solutions, methane-reducing feed additives, improved manure management, and precision agriculture for feed crops. While these innovations can reduce some emissions and pollution, they don't address the fundamental issue, the sheer scale of production needed to meet global demand. As long as billions of consumers expect cheap dairy products every day, the environmental footprint will remain massive. The irony is that many of the regions hardest hit by climate change, drought-prone areas, low-lying coastal zones, and rainforest communities are also impacted by the industrial dairy supply chain. From flooded rivers in the Midwest to poisoned waterways in India, the environmental costs of dairy are not abstract. They are lived realities for millions. Drive through the rural backroads of America's dairy heartlands, Wisconsin, California's Central Valley, parts of Pennsylvania, and you'll see a patchwork of farmhouses, barns, and silos. At first glance, they look like the wholesome symbols of agricultural tradition. But behind the quaint facades and nostalgic imagery lies an unsettling reality: entire communities living under the shadow of industrial dairy operations, breathing in air laced with ammonia, drinking water laced with nitrates, and working in conditions that leave bodies broken and spirits drained. For residents who live near concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFO's daily life is shaped by the farm's rhythms, even if they don't work there. On hot summer days, the smell from manure lagoons can be so strong it forces people indoors, shutting windows and doors just to keep the air breathable. These lagoons, often as large as football fields, emit methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia gases that can cause headaches, nausea, and respiratory issues. Long-term exposure has been linked to chronic bronchitis and other serious health problems. Then there's the water. In parts of rural Wisconsin, wells that once provided clean drinking water now test high for nitrates, a chemical from fertilizer and manure runoff that can cause blue baby syndrome in infants and increase the risk of cancer in adults. In California's Tulare County, one of the most dairy-dense regions in the country, residents have been forced to rely on bottled water for years because their groundwater is too polluted to drink. The irony is bitter. The dairy farms that are touted as the pride of the region are also poisoning the very communities that surround them. Inside the barns, the human toll is just as visible. The dairy industry depends heavily on a workforce that is largely invisible to the public, many of them undocumented immigrants from Mexico and Central America. They arrive in the United States looking for opportunity, often ending up on dairy farms, because the work is considered too grueling or unpleasant for most local residents. Their shifts are long, typically 12 to 14 hours, and the work is relentless. Milking hundreds of cows each day means repetitive motion injuries are common. The cold, damp conditions of the milking parlors can cause joint pain and respiratory illnesses. Workers are often kicked or stepped on by cows, sometimes suffering broken bones. Yet because many are undocumented, they are hesitant to report injuries, fearing retaliation or deportation. They live in small, crowded housing provided by the farms, sometimes without proper heating or sanitation. Language barriers and lack of legal protections compound their vulnerability. Labor unions rarely reach these rural outposts, and when workers speak up about unsafe conditions or wage theft, they risk losing not just their jobs, but their homes. In some cases, workers have reported being paid less than minimum wage, or having their wages withheld entirely, with the implicit threat that they could be reported to immigration authorities if they complain. Mental health is another hidden casualty. Studies show that dairy workers face high rates of depression, anxiety, and even post-traumatic stress disorder. The constant exposure to animal suffering, from injured cows to the separation of calves from their mothers, takes an emotional toll. For some, the work erodes the very empathy that brought them into agricultural work in the first place. Communities surrounding CAFOs also face economic challenges. While industrial dairies may provide some jobs, they can drive small family farms out of business. The economies of scale that megafarms enjoy allow them to produce milk at lower costs, undercutting smaller operations that can't compete. Over time, this consolidates power in the hands of a few large corporations, reducing local control over the land and its resources. The political influence of the dairy industry makes these issues even harder to address. Lobbyists work to block regulations that would limit the size of CAFOs or impose stricter environmental and labor standards. In states like Wisconsin, proposals to cap nitrate pollution or regulate manure storage have been stalled or watered down after pressure from the agricultural lobby. And then there is the public narrative, one carefully curated by the industry. Ad campaigns show farmers as stewards of the land, caring for their animals and feeding the nation. These images rarely include the people who work 70-hour weeks without benefits, or the rural families who can't drink from their own taps. The smiling farmers in commercials are often the owners of large operations, not the workers standing ankle-deep in manure at 3 a.m. The human cost of cheap milk isn't limited to the United States. In countries like India, where small-scale dairies still dominate, rising demand for dairy products is pushing many toward industrialized systems, bringing the same environmental and social consequences seen in the West. In parts of South America, foreign-owned dairy companies operate with minimal oversight, polluting rivers and displacing rural communities with little fear of accountability. Yet the industry has a powerful defense. Milk is seen as a staple, a necessity, a symbol of health. Many consumers, even if aware of these issues, feel powerless to change such a vast system. The idea that the glass of milk in a child's hand might come at the cost of another child's safe drinking water feels abstract until you meet the families living beside these operations. If you only knew the dairy industry through commercials, you'd believe it was the backbone of wholesome family life. Children laughing with milk mustaches, strong farmers in sunlit fields, slogans like "Got milk, milk, does a body good," and "the natural choice." These campaigns aren't just selling a product, they're selling an identity. They've made milk synonymous with health, strength, and tradition, a cultural icon as much as a food. But behind this image is a sophisticated machine of marketing, lobbying, and political influence that ensures the real story stays hidden. The roots of modern dairy marketing can be traced back to the early 20th century. As refrigeration improved and urban populations grew, milk became easier to transport and store, and producers needed to create demand to match supply. The federal government stepped in to help funding nutrition campaigns that promoted milk as essential for children's growth and bone health. By the mid-20th century, this partnership between government and industry had become entrenched. Today, the US Department of Agriculture doesn't just regulate dairy, it actively promotes it. Through programs like Dairy Management Inc., funded by mandatory fees from dairy producers, but working closely with federal agencies, the industry develops marketing campaigns, partners with fast food chains and lobbies for favorable nutrition guidelines. When the USDA updates its dietary recommendations, the dairy lobby ensures that milk, cheese, and yogurt remain prominently featured, despite growing scientific evidence that dairy isn't necessary for most adults and can contribute to health issues. One of the industry's most powerful tools is its ability to create cultural attachment to milk. Campaigns like Got Milk weren't just ads, they became part of pop culture. Celebrities, athletes, and even fictional characters were photographed with the iconic white mustache, lending credibility and desirability to the product. The underlying message was, clear, drinking milk isn't just good for you, it's what successful, attractive, and admirable people do. The industry also knows how to adapt its message. When concerns about saturated fat and cholesterol emerged in the 1980s, dairy marketing pivoted to low-fat and skim milk, portraying them as healthier alternatives. When plant-based milks began to gain traction in the 2010s, dairy boards launched aggressive campaigns to question their nutritional value and authenticity. They lobbied for laws in multiple states and countries to restrict the use of the word milk for non-dairy products, framing soy, almond, and oat milk as imposters. But perhaps the most insidious part of the dairy marketing machine is its reach into schools. Millions of children in the US receive milk through federally subsidized school lunch programs. Industry-funded educational materials often find their way into classrooms presenting dairy as a dietary necessity, without mentioning the environmental or ethical concerns. These programs ensure that milk consumption starts early, creating lifelong habits and preferences, while marketing shapes public perception. Lobbying ensures favorable policies. The dairy industry is one of the most politically connected sectors in agriculture. In the United States, dairy cooperatives and major producers donate millions to political campaigns, particularly in key farming states. They've successfully pushed for massive subsidies, which prop up the industry even when market prices fall. In 2019 alone, US taxpayers provided over $300 million in direct payments to struggling dairy farmers, much of it going to large operations rather than small family farms. These subsidies aren't just about keeping farms afloat. They're about keeping prices low for consumers and ensuring constant demand. Without them, milk would likely be significantly more expensive, and consumption would drop, a scenario the industry is determined to avoid at all costs. This safety net allows large producers to continue operating even when they overproduce, creating a cycle of surplus and waste. In fact, in years of extreme oversupply, millions of gallons of milk have been dumped because they couldn't be sold, a stark contrast to the narrative of scarcity and necessity. The industry's political reach extends beyond US borders. In trade negotiations, dairy access is often a sticking point, with powerful lobbying groups pushing for favorable export terms. In Canada, where a quota system limits production, US dairy interests have fought to break into the market, framing it as an issue of fair trade. In developing countries, dairy giants have promoted milk powder and processed dairy products as modern necessities, often displacing traditional diets and creating dependency on imports. Yet even with all its power, the dairy industry faces growing challenges. Plant-based alternatives are gaining market share. Climate activists are drawing attention to livestock emissions, and younger generations are increasingly skeptical of corporate marketing. The industry's response has been twofold: doubling down on nostalgia-driven advertising, while quietly investing in ways to neutralize its critics. This includes funding scientific research that downplays environmental impacts, creating partnerships with sustainable certification bodies, and launching greenwashed campaigns about animal welfare and carbon reduction. But these PR moves can't erase the reality on the ground: the suffering of the animals, the environmental destruction and the human exploitation built into the system. The dairy industry's survival depends on keeping these truths hidden behind a polished image. Step inside a modern industrial dairy facility, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of cows, but the smell. A mix of manure ammonia and fermented feed clings to the air. It's the scent of a place that runs like a machine, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For the animals who live here, there is no escape. And for the public, the full reality is hidden behind barn doors and marketing gloss. But undercover footage, whistleblower testimonies, and investigative reports have cracked that facade wide open. Perhaps the most controversial and emotionally charged practice in dairy farming is the separation of calves from their mothers. In nature, a calf would nurse from its mother for months, forming a strong bond. On most industrial dairy farms, however, calves are taken within hours of birth. The reason is economic. Every drop of milk the calf drinks is milk that can't be sold. Workers pull the newborn away often as the mother bellows in distress, pacing the pen and calling out for her lost young. This is not anthropomorphizing. Even hardened farmhands have described the sound as haunting, a guttural, anguished cry that can go on for days. The calves' fate depends on their sex. Female calves are usually raised to join the milking herd. They're fed a formula made from powdered milk replacer, kept in individual pens or hutches, and weaned onto solid feed. Male calves, however, are often considered a byproduct. Some are sold for veal production, confined in small crates or pens until slaughter. Others are sold at livestock auctions, sometimes at just a few days old, and endure long, stressful transport to other facilities. Life for the milking cows isn't the pastoral scene shown in commercials. While some smaller farms still let cows graze on pasture, the vast majority of industrial dairy cows spend most or all of their lives indoors, on concrete floors in cramped stalls. Their diet is carefully controlled to maximize milk output, but high production takes a toll on their bodies. The average dairy cow in the United States produces more than double the amount of milk she did 50 years ago, thanks to selective breeding and intensive feeding. This strain can cause metabolic disorders, lameness and mastitis, a painful udder infection that is one of the most common reasons cows are treated with antibiotics. The push for maximum productivity means cows are often milked 2 or 3 times a day, every day, for years. When their production drops, usually after about 4 to 5 years, they're sent to slaughter. In natural conditions, a cow can live 15 to 20 years. In the dairy industry, her life is cut short, not because she's sick beyond recovery, but because she's no longer profitable. Undercover investigations have documented abuses that go beyond the inherent cruelties of the system. Workers hitting or kicking cows to force them into milking parlors. Downed cows too weak or injured to stand being dragged with chains or pushed by machinery. Cows with untreated injuries, open wounds, or severely swollen udders left without proper veterinary care. These incidents are not always isolated bad apple cases. In many reports, they reflect systemic neglect tied to the pace and scale of industrial operations. The industry's official response to such footage is often to condemn the specific facility and stress that it doesn't represent standard practices. But critics point out that the problem is precisely that standard practices themselves, such as early calf separation, intensive confinement, and premature culling, are inherently harmful. In many countries, these practices are perfectly legal, shielded by ag-gag laws that make it a crime to film or expose conditions inside agricultural facilities without permission. Animal welfare advocates argue that transparency is the industry's greatest fear. When people see the reality, not in a documentary years later, but raw and unfiltered, their consumption habits can change. That's why so much of dairy marketing leans on idyllic farm imagery and phrases like family-owned and free-range, even when the product comes from large-scale industrial farms. The gap between image and reality is vast and bridging. It requires public access to information the industry would rather keep locked away. Some farms have made efforts to improve conditions, introducing larger group housing for calves, softer bedding, and more space for cows to move. But these changes are exceptions rather than the rule, and they don't eliminate the fundamental dynamic. Cows are kept pregnant and lactating through most of their lives, producing milk for human consumption instead of their own young. There's a deeper, more uncomfortable truth here. Beyond economics and efficiency, the dairy industry rests on a simple biological fact: milk is the nourishment nature designed for the young of a particular species. To take it, we must take control of the animal's reproductive cycle and her offspring. Whether that act can ever be reconciled with the image of humane farming is a question the industry avoids. For over a century, dairy has been marketed as irreplaceable. Governments, advertisers, and industry groups have ingrained the idea that milk is essential for health growth and strong bones. But in the last decade, a quiet revolution has been brewing, one that's beginning to challenge the very foundation of that belief. It's the rise of dairy alternatives, and it's no longer just a niche trend for vegans and the lactose intolerant. Walk into any supermarket today, and the shelves tell a different story than they did 15 years ago. Almond milk, oat milk, soy milk, cashew milk, coconut milk, and more recently blends that combine multiple plant sources, now sit alongside cow's milk in the refrigerated section. Coffee shops proudly offer oat lattes, grocery stores carry vegan cheese that melts and stretches, and plant-based yogurts are becoming as commonplace as their dairy counterparts. The shift is driven by three intersecting forces: health, ethics, and the environment. On the health front, studies have called into question dairy's long-touted benefits. While milk is a source of calcium and protein, it's also high in saturated fat, which is linked to heart disease. Large segments of the global population are lactose intolerant, meaning they can't digest dairy without discomfort. For them, plant-based milks aren't just a choice, they're a necessity. Ethically, the growing awareness of animal welfare issues in the dairy industry has pushed many consumers to look for alternatives. As undercover investigations and documentaries gain mainstream attention, the moral cost of a glass of milk is harder to ignore. People are realizing that it's not only meat production that involves suffering. Dairy, too, requires the manipulation of animals' reproductive systems and the separation of mothers from their calves. Environmentally, the argument for ditching dairy is compelling. Cows are methane producers, a potent greenhouse gas that contributes to climate change. Dairy farming also requires enormous amounts of water and land, far more than most plant-based alternatives. Almond milk, for example, has been criticized for its water use, but it still requires a fraction of the resources needed to produce cow's milk. Oat and soy milk have even smaller environmental footprints. These factors have created a booming market. In the United States alone, plant-based milk sales grew by more than 20% between 2020 and 2022, while traditional dairy sales stagnated or declined. Globally, the plant-based dairy market is projected to reach tens of billions of dollars in the coming years. The dairy industry has noticed, and it's worried. In several states, dairy lobbyists have pushed for laws restricting the use of terms like milk, cheese, and yogurt for plant-based products. Their argument is that such terms mislead consumers, but critics say it's really about protecting market share. The industry has also ramped up marketing campaigns emphasizing real dairy as more nutritious and natural than alternatives. Interestingly, some of the biggest players in dairy are now hedging their bets by investing in plant-based companies. Danone, one of the largest dairy producers in the world, acquired White Wave Foods, the maker of Silk and Alpro. Other major dairy brands have launched their own lines of oat and almond milk. This move isn't born out of sudden moral enlightenment, it's pure business strategy. As consumer preferences shift, these companies want to ensure they still dominate the shelves. But the rise of alternatives is more than just a market trend, it's also a cultural shift. In younger generations, dairy isn't seen as the unquestioned default. Teenagers are growing up with oat milk in their cereal, almond milk in their smoothies, and coconut cream in their desserts. This is important because taste preferences formed early often last a lifetime. Yet challenges remain. Many plant-based alternatives are more expensive than cow's milk, putting them out of reach for some consumers. Others worry about processing. Some plant-based milks contain additives or sweeteners to improve taste and texture. And while environmental impacts are generally lower, crops like almonds and coconuts come with their own sustainability concerns. Still, the momentum is undeniable. The cultural monopoly dairy once enjoyed is slipping, and that's making the industry nervous. What's more, consumer advocacy groups are linking personal choices to systemic change, arguing that every gallon of plant-based milk purchased is a gallon less demand for dairy and thus fewer animals subjected to its practices. We stand at a pivotal moment in the story of dairy, one where the past and the future are colliding. For over a century, the industry has operated largely unquestioned, shielded by cultural traditions, powerful marketing, and deep political influence. But now cracks are showing. Consumer habits are changing, scientific consensus on health and environmental issues is shifting, and the moral debate around animal welfare is louder than ever. The question is no longer whether the dairy industry will change, but how and on whose terms. On one side are those advocating for reform. These voices, including some farmers' scientists and animal welfare advocates, argue that the dairy industry can be made significantly more humane and sustainable without being dismantled entirely. They point to innovations like pasture-based systems, rotational grazing, and on-farm renewable energy. These approaches reduce environmental impact, give cows more space and access to natural behaviors, and allow for longer lifespans. There are also emerging technologies aimed at removing the cow from the equation altogether. Precision fermentation can create milk proteins identical to those found in cow's milk without involving animals at all. Companies like Perfect Day are already producing ice cream and other dairy products using this method with far lower environmental footprints and no animal suffering. Advocates see this as the third way, keeping the taste and functionality of dairy, while eliminating the ethical and ecological costs. However, skeptics warn that such changes will always be limited as long as the core economic incentives remain. Large-scale dairy production is driven by efficiency and profit, not compassion. Even humane farms still require the cycle of impregnation, separation, and slaughter. And even the most eco-friendly operations require more land, water, and feed than plant-based alternatives. On the other side are those calling for a complete phase-out of animal-based dairy. They argue that reform is insufficient because the system itself is built on exploitation, not just of animals, but also of workers and the environment. For them, the path forward is clear: replace dairy with plant-based or lab-grown alternatives entirely, while supporting farmers in transitioning to other forms of agriculture. This is not a fringe view anymore. It's gaining traction among climate scientists, environmental NGOs, and consumer advocacy groups worldwide. For farmers, this crossroads is deeply personal. Dairy farming is not just a job, it's often a family legacy. Generations have poured their lives into the work, enduring long hours and economic uncertainty. In many rural areas, dairy farms are pillars of the community. Asking them to abandon this livelihood without a viable alternative isn't just unrealistic, it's cruel in its own way. That's why any meaningful shift will require robust support systems, from financial aid to retraining programs, to ensure farmers aren't left behind. Governments will play a decisive role. For decades, public policy has propped up dairy through subsidies, price controls, and promotional programs. Redirecting those funds towards sustainable alternatives could reshape the market almost overnight. Imagine if the billions spent promoting milk in schools were instead used to offer a variety of nutritious beverages, or if subsidies supported oat or hemp farmers in regions where dairy is in decline. And then there's us, the consumers. Every purchase we make sends a signal. When we choose plant-based milk over cow's milk or support companies investing in ethical innovation, we help shift demand. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of massive industries and entrenched systems. But consumer behavior has already forced change in other sectors, from tobacco to fossil fuels. The dairy industry is no different. Still, the road ahead is complex. Cultural traditions run deep. For many, dairy is tied to childhood memories, national identity, or religious customs. Change will not happen overnight, and it won't happen evenly across the globe. In some regions, dairy remains a vital source of nutrition, where alternatives are scarce or expensive. In others, it's a luxury product with a heavy carbon cost. Solutions must be tailored, not one size fits all. What's clear is that the status quo is unsustainable. The environmental toll, the moral cost, and the growing consumer resistance are all converging into a force that no amount of marketing can fully contain. Whether dairy transforms into a smaller, more ethical industry, or is gradually replaced by alternatives will depend on the decisions made in the next decade by governments, corporations, and individuals alike. Perhaps the most important shift we need is in mindset. For too long, the dairy debate has been framed as a binary drink milk, or don't support farmers or save animals tradition or progress. But the reality is far more nuanced. We can honor the hard work of farmers while acknowledging the need for change. We can enjoy rich, creamy flavors without causing suffering. We can preserve elements of our food culture while steering it toward a more just and sustainable future. The dark truth about the dairy industry isn't just about the cruelty or the pollution. It's about how deeply we've accepted a system without questioning it. Now that the truth is out, we have a choice. Close our eyes and carry on, or open them and help shape something better. The future of dairy is being written now. The question is, what side of history will we be on?